Good evening, everybody. I think we'd better make a start. Great to see so many people here in person, and congratulations on having found the room, which I always found challenging. And if you came all the way from the environment department like I did, then well done on even kind of making it across in the cold weather this evening. My name's John Enser. I'm the Director of the International Global Development Centre, and this is our annual lecture this evening. The IGDC is, well, it is what it says on the tin. We are a collection of researchers and academics from across the university, different departments and centres, all of which are connected together by an interest in topics connected to global development. And our role as IGDC is really to provide a home for all the research and practice that goes on across the university connected to global development, and to make sure there's a community that doesn't mean that prevents us all from being kind of atomised and disconnected just because we happen to work in a different department or part of the university from each other. So we encourage academics from humanities, social sciences, natural scientists to come together. We try to engender collaboration around research proposals, and mainly to engage with one another and with policymakers and practitioners to take on different global development challenges. So if you're not already a member of IGDC, whether you're a member of the university or not, you can become a member, and I encourage you to do so. IGDC is prominently hosted on the University of York website, so please do look us up. With that, I'd like to welcome and introduce our speaker, Duncan Green. Hi. Duncan is Professor in Practice in International Development at the LSE, the London School of Economics.
And Political Science.
And is the LSE's Firoz Lalji, you're also a Professor at the Firoz Lalji Institute for Africa. And he's recently ended 20 years of association with Oxfam GB, where Duncan was head of research and a senior strategic advisor for Oxfam. He's also director of the Global Executive Leadership Initiatives Programme on Influencing, and this is pertinent to tonight's talk, run by UNOPS and hosted by LSE, which since 2022 has been training groups of senior leaders at the UN, in international NGOs, in national NGOs, and the Red Cross, how to become more effective in influencing government, societies, and the international and intergovernmental system. Duncan's the author of numerous books, including well-known From Poverty to Power, How Active Citizens and Effective States Can Change the World, and the subject of today's talk, and indeed a new edition from Oxford University Press, How Change Happens. Duncan, over to you.
Right. Thanks, John. Thanks for the invitation. Well, the good thing about talking in a really cold room is the chances of people going to sleep are reduced. I'll try and make sure that they're reduced to zero by keeping this quite short and punchy. So let's start with models of activism, okay? So here's two of my favourites, right? This one, He Spoke Truth to Power, which is a kind of model of activism, which is, I'm going to say something because I feel strongly about it, I'm going to speak truth to power, and if I get beheaded, that's fine, right? That's one model. Then this one I love. You can't really make him out, but he's a super geeky bloke. And that's obviously, I hope it's an ironic placard, I'm not entirely sure, and that's from the 2015 March for Science in Washington. And most activists, I think, lie somewhere on a spectrum. In a university, this one, people sometimes believe that this is how you're going to bring about change, one peer-reviewed journal article at a time. And out there in sort of civil society and NGO land and protest land, people talk about speaking truth to power as though that's enough. And I suppose the essence of the book and the essence of this talk is that neither of these are enough. Okay? You need to be intentional about achieving change, you have to actually be analytical about the system you are trying to change and the people you're going to work with to bring about that change and the people you're going to talk to bring about that change. So the problem is that a lot of activism looks like this, right? I've got two big ideas which I'm going to talk about: systems and power. Let's start with systems. Activism looks like this. Yeah, it's a cake. And to make a cake, you need ingredients, a recipe, and an oven. And if you follow the recipe and the ingredients are okay and the oven's working, you can produce a cake. And the cake will be, my cakes do not look as nice as this, but they are cake-like objects which can roughly be eaten, right? This is the project, right? The project has a recipe, ingredients, and an oven. People churn out projects in activism, in NGOs, in the aid business, but much more widely. And to such an extent that it's actually, if you go all John Lennon and say, imagine there's no projects, people go into a kind of fetal huddle. They can't actually imagine doing activism without forming it into a series of linked projects, each with their own time span, their own set of activities. And this comes out of infrastructure post-World War II, but it has now permeated throughout activism and has become a sort of crucial artifact of the way we think. The trouble is that it is being used in places like this. This is a famous leaked PowerPoint from the Pentagon in 2003. General Petraeus asked a consultant to do a stakeholder map of Afghanistan to help the Pentagon sharpen up their thinking about what they were doing. And the consultant went away, did actually a very, very good stakeholder map, came back, put it up on the screen, and General Petraeus sacked him immediately, right? And it was leaked, and it achieved the ultimate Jon Stewart took the piss out of it on The Daily Show. There's no higher praise. Front page of the New York Times. But actually, it's a really good attempt to understand a complex system. A complex system is characterized by a lot of elements and a lot of interactions. And the interactions of a set of feedback loops, people influencing each other. And the salient fact about a complex system is that if you prod it with 10,000 Marines, in this case, or $100 million of aid, effects will ripple through the system, and there is no computer smart enough to predict what will happen. And if change happens, and many of these systems are volatile, it will be almost impossible to attribute it to a particular cause. So you don't have prediction and you don't have attribution. And yet we are working with the artifact of cakes, of projects, which rely entirely on prediction and attribution. That's what people in monitoring and evaluation do. They say, we did this, we achieved this, aren't we great, give us some more money. Right? So there is a sort of central dilemma about applying those models of activism to real life. So the idea in the book, and the idea John mentioned some of the training we're doing with the UN and so on, is, okay, so if it's not a cake, what else do you do? The first thing about how change happens in those complex systems, there are patterns of change which are relevant to activism, okay? Multiple feedback loops. So you have to really be curious about who's influencing what, what's the impact of history, what's the impact of the environment, technology, all the different factors which loop into each other to bring about change. But also, change is very rarely smooth. There are these massive critical junctures, windows of opportunity, windows of threat, which are often the focus of attention for activists. And if you're working on the Middle East, as I do, right now, we are in the middle of the mother of critical junctures. Who knows what's going to happen after Syria? But what you can be sure of is that anybody working on anything to do with, say, human rights in the Middle East or the refugee issue in Syria is going to face a whole lot of opportunities, a whole lot of threats, and any plans they had before last week are out the window. They're going to have to do something different. They're going to have to respond. If they try and carry on with their plans, they're going to look ridiculous. But that's true, that's true at the big scale, but it's also true at the small scale. I've done a lot of stories of change with communities who've done interesting things, and they also have these moments when there was a conflict, somebody was beaten up, some new leader appeared, or someone ran off with the money, or whatever. There are these moments which also trigger big moments of change. Path dependence. So everywhere looks like the Afghan map, but no two Afghan maps are the same. Everywhere is the product of its own history, which is kind of obvious. But then what does that mean for our best practice? For all these things that activists say, well, I've studied activism in the southern US, so I know how to make change happen in London. You go, okay, yeah, interesting. Any differences, do you think, between Alabama and Brixton? So what are you talking about there? How do you adapt good experiences from one place to make them relevant to another? And causation, sorry, anybody trying to prove impact, you've got a horrible job. The second big concept is power, all right? I have a very dated set of cultural references, basically to when my kids were teenagers and we would watch films together and read Harry Potter together. And so, all my references is kind of the noughties, really. Can I still use this one? Is this okay? It's called The Matrix. It was a film once, right? First Matrix film, great. Second and third, absolutely dire. Don't try and avoid them if you can. There's a moment in The Matrix when Neo, the insanely beautiful Keanu Reeves, perceives the matrix behind reality, which is a whole system of ones and noughts, binary, and suddenly becomes an invincible ninja warrior, right? And for me, power is like the matrix of change. Power is the sort of the underlying reality of why things are unfair, need to be fixed, need to be changed, is that power isn't fairly distributed, but also that redistributing power, understanding power, moving power around is what activists are doing when they try and bring about change. And I'll try and give you some idea what that actually means, because it sounds a bit abstract and wishy-washy, but I'll try and give you some idea of what that means. So there are any number of power frameworks, and I heard a great saying the other day, everybody has a framework. It's like having a toothbrush. Everybody's got their own framework and nobody wants to use anyone else's, all right? Which I thought was rather good. But here are a couple of the frameworks which we do use other people's toothbrushes because they're really useful, all right? I think I better stop working. I don't want to pursue that. So this is a framework from a woman called Jo Rowlands, who was at Oxfam with me. She wrote a book on women's empowerment in Honduras and tried to understand what she was seeing in the way of empowerment as women got involved in social movements in Honduras. And she did a very simple 4 powers model. Power within is the light bulb moment when women suddenly become aware of their rights, of what's not, what they object to, what they get a sense of agency. And that can come through involvement in the church, involvement in the women's movement, a heroic leader, a particular personal experience, all sorts of things flip the switch. And when the switch is flipped, they look around and they find people in similar situations and they start to organise. Right? So you start to get an upsurge in mobilisation in different forms. Some of them do well, some of them get frustrated, but that sort of bubbling away starts. And then you get power 2. If those organisations flourish and they start to see what needs to change in their situation, then they can start to actually target particular laws, policies, social norms, and elections and so on, and maybe even take power. And then you're talking about what you do once you're in power, not something social movements have much experience with, but they do have some. Another useful framework. Rao and Kelleher are 2 really fascinating authors who've been working on gender rights for decades and decades and decades. And they summarised, they produced this model which I think is really helpful. And I recommend it a lot to I have a master's course on activism at the LSE, which is great. It gets all the biggest troublemakers in the LSE and we try and get them to be more effective at causing trouble. And I recommend this one on anybody working on social norms, on what's going on inside people's heads. What they have is a 2x2 with system at a systemic level, at an individual level, in the informal world or the formal level, world. If it's individual and formal, you've got things like credit, tools, seeds, access to resources. If it's formal and systemic, you're talking about institutions, laws, and policies. And what Rao and Kelleher say is that the aid business and activism is often much happier on the right-hand side. Whereas if you've had any contact with the women's movement over the last 4 or 5 decades, you'll realise how important this side is as well. So increasingly I've seen over the last 20 years, aid in particular, the aid business trying to wrestle with what do we do about some of these left-hand side issues. Consciousness, norms, values, practices. And it's, again, a very useful tool. Now, that's all very fine. But that's not actually how I learned about this stuff. How I learned about this stuff was going on field trips, which now are really hard to do because we're all decolonized and they don't want whitey coming over and getting in the way and sucking up resources. But at the time, in the sort of 2000s, I got to do some fascinating field trips, and they were my light bulb moment. They were my sort of switch going on. This was one in India where Oxfam took me to visit some fishing communities who had for centuries been fishing these artificial ponds, but they're big lakes. They're not just little ponds, they're big lakes. And they were from the lower caste in this part of it was about 6 hours from Delhi, a place called the Bundelkhand. They were lower caste, treated like dirt, but they were left to fish the ponds, and they just about made a living. And then somebody discovered that if you seeded the ponds with fry or eggs, the yields went through the roof, right? Which was a disaster for these communities, because then the rich guys smelt the money, came in, drove them off the ponds, seized the lakes, and seized the production. A few of the youth stood up to it and said, "You can't. Yeah, there are ponds." And the new pond lords hired thugs to beat them up. And that was a little critical juncture, or quite a big critical juncture for those 12 guys, because the communities just got really pissed off with the way that their youth were being treated and started to organise. So that was the sort of light bulb moment, and then they started to form power with, right? Into the mix, if there'd just been a bunch of lower caste fishing communities organising, probably they wouldn't have got very far, but there appeared an unlikely white knight over the horizon in the form of an NGI, a non-governmental individual. Okay, these are the people you meet if you travel around the world who are usually quite affluent, and they have a briefcase, and in their briefcase they have a project, and they try and sell you the project. You know, and it's a livelihood. This NGI was a former civil servant. It's not an official title. If you don't use it in your essays, if you're students, please. It's a kind of satirical but well recognised thing. He was upper caste, and he went to talk to the fishing communities, understood what they needed, and he was able to open the door. So he opened the door to the police chief, who took a piece of public interest litigation. He got them in a meeting with the politicians, and the state passed a federal state law saying if they formed a cooperative, they had the rights to the pond. Okay, and when I went there the first time, they had about 100 ponds been reclaimed in this way, and they were doing very well. I then did the high-risk thing of going back 10 years later, which if you ever find a successful aid program, it's usually best not to go back, because when you go back, you find you misunderstood it. It was actually a disaster, or someone's run off with the money, or something terrible's happened. But actually, it was still going well, even better. They bought cold trucks to try and get more of the supply chain, to get the fish to market, and the number of ponds had increased. And it was a really fascinating sort of story about how technological change led to an unexpected dispossession, but then also led to a process of building power within and power with, leading to power to, leading to some really productive change. So that was, after I'd sort of tried to understand that, I then went and read loads of stuff and came up with, and found some theories which helped to explain it. But it was definitely, this was the start of it all. Implications for change makers. Nothing is a monolith. So this is a sort of mantra that we repeat with my students. Do not talk about the government, the state, the private sector. Each of those are one of those complex systems. Within each of those, there will be people who agree with you, people who disagree with you, people who like each other, people who hate each other. The job of an activist is to get deep into the systems they're trying to influence and find out all that gossip and all that stuff about relationships. And that requires emotional intelligence. And one of the things which activists are sometimes really good at and are often not very good at what we call POVO, the point of view of the other. Do you understand a person who votes for Brexit or Donald Trump? How deeply do you understand why they do that? How much have you got the emotional intelligence to walk in their shoes, see why they feel like they feel? Or why a minister glazes over when they're being lectured about climate change, or gets excited when they're being lectured about climate change. So this is, relationships and POVO are really at the heart of effective. I've seen effective influencers and I've seen ineffective influencers, and the difference is this bit. And for that to work, you've got to be curious. Gossip is cool. Gossip is useful. In the aid business, the gossip all happens in the pub or in the restaurant after a long day of doing boring meetings, and you've got to bring it out of the restaurant into the office. Another really difficult thing, I think, for activists is that ambiguity and uncertainty are not something that can be erased by one more meeting. They're an essential quality of complex systems, and you've got to learn to love it. You've got to actually think, oh, this is exciting, I don't know what's going on. A lot of my colleagues hate that because they want to have certainty so that they can lead, say, forward. And you've got to be able to lead and embrace that uncertainty at the same time. The great leaders can do it, the great activists can do it. You've got to learn how to do it. Obviously, anything linear, terrible. And that point about critical junctures, you've got to be ready, right? So it's not just enough to say they exist, you've got to be ready to spot them. I was telling John, I've got to give a lecture on, we asked our students what they wanted for their last lecture of term. And one of the things they've asked for is your greatest failures, all right? So, sport for choice. And what you learn from them, right? And one of the big failures I noticed, I'm sure there are many I haven't, was I was head of research, head of research, and at Oxfam. And in 2010, I think it was, there was an enormous spike of food prices around the world, riots in 30 countries, extraordinary collapse of what had been a stable food system with falling prices. And the first thing we knew about it was the journalists phoning us up and asking for a comment, because we did not have systems in place to put together the intel from all those countries. So we just didn't know, which is appalling. But you've got to have an ability to spot when those critical junctures are coming as quickly as possible, because there's a limited time when you can actually do anything in that window. And if you wait until everything's clear, it'll be too late. Okay, so the book first came out in 2016, which was, it's never a good time to publish a book because, it's always going to be some kind of tombstone albatross thing where, immediately something happens that invalidates the book. But 2016 was particularly crap in that, we had Brexit and Donald Trump straight after the book was published. And the book was a kind of hooray, hooray, rah, rah activism thing. And it's like, oh. So I decided to do another edition this year, and we went back. I went back and looked at what needed to be changed and what still stands, and the implications for the activists I was speaking to then and I'm speaking to now. So some things I think have stood the test of time, and in fact I'll probably drilling down further into it. The power and systems thinking piece seems to be very useful. People find it useful, so I'm sticking with that. Norms, which were a bit of a kind of edgy idea in terms of a target for activists outside feminism and the women's movement, have become much more central now across much bigger bits of, say, the UN system, for example. So that's interesting. Lots more interest in these other players. So traditional aid has quite a limited sort of cast list of the state, the private sector, and civil society organisations, formal ones with names and websites and who can do funding applications. And in somewhere like the Congo, you can go to parts of the country where none of those actually matter very much, where what actually happens is determined by the Catholic Church, armed groups, secret societies, peasant organisations who don't have a website, and so there's been a lot of interest in something which has now got a name, public authority. What do people, what sets the rules? Who sets the rules? Which institutions, which kinds of organisations sets the rules? And then how do activists engage with those? Like watching Oxfam systematically avoid engaging with faith groups has been fascinating. I call it the flip chart problem, where in a meeting you're talking about who we need to work with on a certain topic, and I say faith groups, and people go, yeah, faith groups, yeah. And then you look at the end of the flip chart at the end of the meeting, and there's nothing on faith groups. People are just sort of, the secular bias is so deeply embedded that it just somehow gets spat out. And yet, if you any research on the lives of poor people, they are massively motivated by their faith. And actually, many Oxfam members of staff, activists, partners, massively motivated by their faith. So it's a very odd conundrum of finding it very hard to incorporate something which is faith-based. We do evidence-based policy. We don't do faith-based policy. So I think it's a really interesting challenge to a very secular rationalist world of activism and aid that actually that's not how people tick, right? The critique of linearity in aid has led to a spate of jargon, which is obviously always a sign of progress. So it's thinking and working politically. There's a whole community, a COP, community of practice. There's adaptive management, which has the radical idea that if something changes when you're doing a program, you should probably change to reflect that. And this is seen as revolutionary in the aid business. Asset-based approaches, which is saying let's not look at what people lack, let's see what they've got and build on that. That's still really not breaking through, I think, as in terms of how people talk, in terms of how activists in the aid business talk. And some of them just are not getting anywhere near the traction I'd like to see. Positive deviance, I won't talk about because of time, but it's I think a really interesting approach to asset-based thinking about how you bring about change. What needed to be added or changed? Chapter on digital, which sort of covered both the sort of happy days of the early 2010s and Arab Spring and debates on whether the revolution would be tweeted and all this kind of thing, and then the slide into the dark side, brilliantly captured in Maria Reis's book How to Stand Up to a Dictator, where she started off being a Facebook a junkie and Mark Zuckerberg's best friend, and then ended up just finding it absolutely impossible to work in the digital space in the way that she wanted to as an activist. Another brilliant book, New Power, trying to codify how digital activism works. I think it's been very, very effective. This whole issue of populism, backlash, closing civic space, another great book, The Revenge of Power by Moises Naim from Venezuela. So I cover that, but I'm still pretty optimistic, and I'm not sure if that's just inertia or whether I am genuinely optimistic, but I think there's a lot of things that are still happening, and if you're actually working with social movements, they haven't all given up and gone home just because of Donald Trump. Quite the opposite. So I think there's a lot of excitement still going on around what people are doing on the ground. And then a sort of more meta thing, the first edition of the book was very sceptical about toolkits. There's a thing called the log frame in the aid business, which is like a horrible, horrible weight around your neck. You have to fill in these tables, and why no one knows, and you have to just do them to get the money. And that's what every toolkit turns into, this kind of thing, this box ticking exercise. I think I've moved on a bit, and I now think there's a bunch of tools that can actually be useful in opening up thinking. I'm going to skip through a couple of slides, I think, just for the interest of time. How long are we doing?
You're all right, actually. Half 15, 20 minutes.
I've got another 15, 20 minutes? Oh. Okay. I won't skip then. So populism. So I was, 2016, the end of Obama. The arc of history bends towards justice. That didn't look so good. And I think there's a temporary reprieve in the UK right now because of the Labour victory and the Tory party self-destruction. But just look around you and it's hard to be that optimistic about the direction of politics. I think Keir Starmer is the blip, not the Tory party, I fear. To be discussed. But let's look at how the left responded to that 2016 moment. And I think it was pretty depressing and pretty unimpressive. So there was a moment after Trump was elected when everybody said, we've got to read Hillbilly Elegy. We've got to understand why these people do stupid things. We've got to, I did a test on Twitter, which was working then, and 97% of my Twitter followers were Hillary Clinton supporters. I appear to have been in something of a bubble. So we're going to stop doing that. We're going to find out how people think. We're going to fan out and listen. And no, they didn't. They just very quickly, circled the wagons and got back into arguing about toilets. And so I think there's been very, very sort of missed chance to try and really understand what was going on out there. And this was summarised for me in a recent conversation about just how profound this is when one of these UN people we're training with said, I don't know what to do anymore because everything in my traditional repertoire is now a risk for the people I'm talking to. If I'm trying to support an activist organisation in a country, if I say anything in public, the government will say it's foreign interference. If I give them money, the government will say it's foreign control. If I use human rights language, government will talk about that stuff being imposed from outside, right? That's been so effective that actually large parts of what we took for granted as an international system which pushed things in a certain direction has now become a liability rather than an asset. And I think that's quite a sort of existential challenge to organisations like the United Nations when it's actually trying to do something. On the digital side, what do I pick up here? I mean, the best thing I think is this bit from that book I mentioned, New Power, where they said, it's no longer, you don't really have that Malcolm Gladwell type debate from 2011 of, is this collectivism or is it real activism? Because there is no real activism which doesn't have a digital component now, pretty much. So it's actually, how do you combine them? But there is something different about the new power that what Hims and Hyman argue that old power is like a currency. If I've got some, you can't have it. I may give it to you, but basically it's more of a zero-sum thing. New power is this current which just suddenly surges. Everybody starts watching Coney 2012 or doing the Ice Bucket Challenge or doing something more useful, and it's not the same. The dynamics are really different, and they sort of summarise it there. And they talk about the kinds of tactics which you need to work in this new power world as actionable, so people have actually got to be able to do something with it. It's not just signing a petition. It's got to be something that you can make your own, that connects you, that you can start showing to other people, even if it's just putting a mark on your face and sending a photo to someone. And you've got to be able to customise it. Right? It's got to be fun. You've got to be able to mess around with it. Once you do that, then you start getting massive virality, and you can get much more impact. And that's a different way of thinking. So I know it's interesting. The LSE, our students are not very good at this. They basically think digital means a Twitter campaign, and they find it very hard to actually turn this into real ideas. Some toolkits, and I'm just going to name check these for people who are interested, I think are useful. So I'm a big fan of this one, the fishbone, also known as the Ishikawa diagram, which is just a way of analysing a problem, all the different causes of a problem, and finding points of entry for activism which you think might have a chance of succeeding. And there's some criteria for how you select these things. And it just means you keep the whole system in mind, but you start to turn it into a form that you can actually analyse and think, what are we going to do with our bit of, with the time we've got as activists. Huge fan of stakeholder mapping. Again, it doesn't tell you the whole world, but you put stakeholders on a map of influence versus how much they support you, and you start to find clusters of players. Like here will be high influence, high support, they're your allies. what do you do with them, is different from here, which is supportive but low influence. So there you might well be trying to get coalitions moving up, talking to here. People on the fence, what do you do with people on the fence? You don't publish peer-reviewed journal articles and send them to them. You might well think, who do they listen to? Who do they respect or fear? Can we get the right messenger in to talk to them there? And so on. So you can use that. This is a nice little tool from Birmingham University, if I'm allowed to mention other universities, on POVO. The questions you ask to try and get inside someone's head. Is what they want clear? Are they acting in line with their core beliefs? Because if so, don't tell them to do something different. And what constraints do they face? Even prime ministers can't do anything they want. So, understand that. Then this, for the kind of like full-on, the 160 degrees proof version is the Institute of Development Studies Power Cube, which I'm not even going to try and explain. But it's actually very useful and not that. They've managed to make it look, which is an IDS speciality, look more difficult than it really is. Okay, but it's very useful once you actually start working with it. Sorry, any ex-IDS people? I love IDS. I love IDS. So finally, implications for activists. Activism can and is still making a difference all over the place. COVID was amazing. We did a project on emerging agency during a time of COVID and just saw these things popping up, gender-based violence movements in China because women were getting beaten up even more because people were being locked up, and that happened all over the world. But we saw really interesting attempts to counter that in China. We saw disability movements because disabled people suddenly lost all their, access to services. So this is still, it doesn't just stop. We don't have the luxury of thinking, oh, it's really depressing, isn't it? The world's shit. Because this is going on all over the place, and it's happening in different ways in different places, and it's utterly fascinating. Our argument is to do this, it's not enough to do either this or this. And there's a phrase from a woman called Donella Meadows, who wrote a fantastic book called Thinking in Systems, who said you've got to learn to dance with the system. All right? So you've got to understand the way the system moves and then move with it in the right way. And then you can actually start to push when it can be pushed, go back when it needs to, when you need to go back, and actually be in tune with what's going on and understanding power. And then really difficult, I think it's not easy, this stuff, or somebody would be doing it, lots more people would be doing it. But I think there is some sense of effective activism which manages to combine things which are really hard to combine. So you need to be Machiavelli and you need to be angry. You need to have that analytical way of thinking about power and structures and systems, but you mustn't lose the thing that motivates you in the first place, the sense of injustice, the sense of trying to make the world a better place. And crucially, the empathy for other people. And it's very easy to have one of these, loosely speaking, academics, protesters, psychotherapists, but you've got to be all three, right? And that's very, very hard, but I think the results when people do this can be really amazing. So I'm going to stop there.
Perfect, fabulous. Thank you, Duncan. Questions? I've got a mic that God, it's really difficult to get anybody in this room, isn't it? I'll throw at you. It's an
extraordinary design. I mean, why didn't they leave a little aisle up here? Anyway.
I can see one. Have we got? I might take two or three. Maybe we'll kick it off just with one and see how we go.
If it's okay, I might have a slightly fiddly one. I wanted to raise one thing before the question really. The fact that you said Starmer seems to be a blip in the general trend, as someone who associates with many activists, all of whom who passionately hate Starmer and see him as entirely continuous to the previous order and not going to roll any of it back. If you wouldn't mind substantiating that somewhat, it might give us a note of optimism. I also wondered...
you see, it's even worse than I said, you mean?
I mean, in the sense that people hate him and see him as a cop and him wanting to imprison activists and turn against XR and so forth. Yeah. That kind of thing. If you can add a note of optimism, that would be nice, but with more substance. What I wanted to ask was one or two things which you didn't include but could really speak to. Co-optation, the bane of all activists, along with other forms of violence, and the other side, burnout, in the sense that all activist communities are plagued by this thing of burnout. You get very invested. It speaks to a question of renewal. How do you keep getting more activists rather than just having single heroic figures doing everything? Sorry.
Yes, nice. Okay. So I don't think they're all the same. Sorry. I may be naive, but 40 billion hike in spending is not nothing. The Tories are worse than Labour. I mean, sure, Labour's got lots of weaknesses, but I'm not part of that. But I'm not going to. Let's not talk about that. But just locate myself in the holding my nose and voting Labour category. All right, the Polly Toynbee sort of group. I'll take the other two together: co-optation and burnout. There's a model of activism which I think is probably closer to this one, which is that it is a personal expression of rejection or outrage or injustice, and you could never do enough to express that, and you must just work harder. And any attempt to do things like have fun. There's a fantastic book about the Labour Party in, I think, the 1980s where they were talking about how eating vegetables was at one point seen as Tory. Things can only get better, John O'Farrell, right? Just a really funny book, whether you agree it or not. So that kind of almost like hair shirtism in activism, I think is painful to watch, because people do get just massively burnt out. Sometimes they get burnt out by being activists. Sometimes they get burnt out by being in really crap, badly managed organisations. I mentioned no names, Oxfam, but there are different reasons why people burn out. And you need to understand that. But there is, you've got to pace it. It's not a thing you do while you're young and don't have kids and then go and get a proper job. If that's the way you're approaching it, then I think that's a real shame, because you're actually not bringing the experience and the networks and the things you need to be an effective activist. I'm a great believer in grey panthers. The fact that, often people who are just retired, they've got everything. They've got time, money, contacts. They know how things work, and they want to make a difference before it's too late. And you get some astonishing older people in this space. And the NGOs don't want to work with them, because they're too stroppy, they don't do what they're told. People are infatuated with working with youth. Youth have got lots of advantages. What they don't have is staying power and money and contacts. But they have lots of advantages. One other thing about this, which is, and this is more about the co-optation point, most influencing strategies combine a bit of insider and a bit of outsider, right? So you'll have some, at the softer end, media work. You'll talk to people in public. You'll try and get stories in the press, pushing your target in a certain direction, and then you'll talk to the target inside, right? The kinds of activists who do those two things tend to be different, and relations between them can be very, very fraught. Classically, the outsiders get a bit cross with the insiders because they think the insiders are being co-opted, they think the insiders have got it too easy, they're watering down, they're making everything confusing, they're agreeing halfway measures, because that's how agreements work. There's usually a compromise, which a victory usually looks like a compromise to someone, right? The insiders, if they're good insiders, are delighted to have people chucking rocks in the street, because that improves their chances of getting a result. So there's this asymmetry between insiders and outsiders. The insiders like the outsiders are very suspicious of the insiders, and it's absolutely at its biggest point at the moments of victory, which is when a lot of movements fall apart, right? So there was a movement called Jubilee 2000, end of the 90s, extraordinary movement. an obscure biblical text saying that you should forgive debt was turned into this global movement about writing off debts for the poorest countries. They got a really good deal, which I think wrote off $18 billion of debt. And at the very moment when that was being signed, the Jubilee movement fell apart in a castle in Germany because the radical element said, you've betrayed us, you've accepted half measures, and the insiders said, you people know nothing, we're in the room, this is as good as you get. And the fact that the radicals were all from the south and the sort of soft insiders were all from the north just made it worse, right? So, and that just made me think, that is, and you see that, that's a common thing, that this tension between insider and outsider is a real question. Co-optation is a thing. I mean, some governments are really good at it. Mexico's fantastic. Historically, Mexico's been brilliant at just pulling. I don't know how Subcomandante Marcos managed to avoid it, because historically Mexico's this great octopus which just sucks in activists and turns them into ministers. So there is, it is a thing. And the way you avoid that is through having some level of accountability, internal accountability. You've got to have some level of internal democracy, or else it's so easy to pick off leaders. So then you're back to the structure of the protest movements or the change movements or whoever it is, right?
Thank you. A couple of questions. There we go.
Thank you.
We'll never get the mic back now. You're just like, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And it's good to see you again. I was your student 4 years ago on the Advocacy and Activism module at LSE, so it's really good to see you.
What are you doing now?
Yeah, I've just started a PhD.
Excellent.
And my supervisors are in the room anyway. So, my question is, so I just wondered what you thought about this. At what point, really, can activists assert that they've actually achieved meaningful change? And of course, this is considering the fact that, both the impact and necessity for change could be quite subjective, and it's different people and different groups arguing for and against the need and the impact of certain change. So from your experience, I wondered how you've sort of navigated this sort of contention amongst groups that should probably ideally be the beneficiaries of the planned change or the implemented change. So, yeah.
Great.
Can we do one more question?
Oh, okay, I was about to really launch into that one, but okay, fine.
Give you a minute to
Okay.
your thoughts.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. It was quite interesting. I just had a question regarding market-based activism versus political activism, and if you see any differences in these, and also if you see that resources, access to resources are also one factor in effective activism or not.
Nice. Okay, two good questions, thanks. Women in the room, do you care whether you've got the vote or not? Trade unionists in the room, do you care whether you have a trade union or not? There's one of the interesting things about this is that as soon as you win something, it somehow disappears because it becomes part of the structures. It's the same with aid. The people say, oh, aid doesn't work. You go, South Korea, Botswana, Marshall Plan. Those things, as soon as you've achieved something, then people are always moving on to the next thing. And so the spotlight is always on the glass half empty. So I'd say on the big picture, there are obviously massive wins for activism, historically anti-slavery. But also, actually, you can look in the contemporary world and find just fascinating examples of things which have become big markets, dairy co-op movement in Gujarat, or the Self-Employed Women's Association in India, indigenous movements, things which have transformed countries and cultures in our lifetime, or in my lifetime. So there's no shortage of it, I think. I'm sure that the evidence base for activism is stronger than the mood for activism right now. Yeah. Market-based activism. Could you just tell me what you mean by market-based activism before I start shouting?
Regarding activism towards firms.
Oh. Okay. So, yeah, there's a lot of activism towards firms. So things like working on supply chains, trying to curb bad practices by extractive industries. I think that there's been some real wins there. I think they work. I'd say they definitely work when you understand the companies, when you don't just say you're all capitalist bastards. I used to work in something called the Ethical Trading Initiative, where we would sit down, the trade unions, the NGOs, and the big garment retailers and supermarkets, and we'd all come together to try and sort out supply chains. And when we started, C&A, for example, it took them 3 years to find out where their clothes were being made. Right? So they couldn't look at labour standards until they found out where their clothes were being made, because they were buying it through all these intermediaries. So there was just a real practical challenge about doing the right thing, and we understood that. So we didn't slag them off and say, you know, you've done nothing. We tried to work together and achieve this, and we built that trust between those groups, and I think we got some really good results. It's very hard. It's much harder to build these multi-stakeholder connections than to just work with a bunch of people who think like you. But it was very effective. So I think that can work. Access to resources is such a double-edged sword, right? Because you can't, back to the burnout point, right? You can't ask people to do everything for free forever. At some point, someone needs to put food on the table or whatever. But then you lose some of the magic as well. And you see that time and time again, really interesting studies of, Pakistan, for example, where big social movements got a large grant from, I think, DFID, and lost all their members within 6 months. Because even though they weren't corrupt, all their members assumed they were corrupt and that this money was being stolen, right? So it's very hard to absorb the resources you need and keep what they call in Spanish the mística, the mystique of activism. So I think that is one of the big challenges, because you can't just do this over decades, I think, as volunteers, or maybe you can. India's different. India has this extraordinary Gandhian tradition, and people, just amazing. Most countries can't do that, I find. And then you've got to try and find a way of professionalizing or solidifying institutions for activism to take place without destroying it. And I think that's quite a challenge.
Any more questions? Okay. Can I have one last one?
Go for it.
You drew attention to norms and the kind of emerging centrality of norms, and I'm interested in the kind of interplay of norms and structures. So we've been having conversations about environmental activists recently who find the decision makers who they're trying to influence in private conversations agree with their values and principles, but are held in places and working in institutions where they're not allowed to make decisions that align with their own personal norms and beliefs. How do you navigate? Is there a recipe?
John, could you use the microphone? Sorry, you're facing that way.
I'm really sorry. That's a cardinal sin, isn't it? What an amateur. I've forgotten what I said now. Norms and structures. So my example is of people working in grassroots environmental movements who are able to gain access to decision makers and in conversations, informal conversations, recognise that actually the decision makers share the same norms, principles, values as the activists, but they're unable to act on them because of the constraints that they're placed under within their organisations. And is there a formula? Is there a way through that impasse?
It's a good question. I mean, so York is where Alex Evans lives, right? Mm-hmm. I think. So you've got someone in the city who's done a lot of thinking about norms and how you harness faith-based narratives for work on climate change. So things like the Exodus and stories which appear in all the major faiths and are not being used by the climate change activism. So I think he's doing really interesting stuff. He's got some new NGO called Cognitive. It's got a complicated name. He needs to change the name. So I think that's one thing. I was the sort of token atheist at the Catholic aid agency CAFOD for a few years. And so many times at the end of a meeting where I would be giving somebody in government a really hard time about something, and at the end of it they go, "I'm a fervent Catholic. Good show. You carry on." And you just sensed that there was this huge latent normative support which we weren't harnessing. Now, how do you do that? You need to understand the constraints they're under, but you also need to put your messages in the language that will work for them personally, and find a way of marrying those two things. And I don't think it's that they're totally in opposition, And often what decision makers are thinking is not how do I get rich, or the things we think they think. So just last story, in that ethical trading initiative I was mentioning, I was trying to recruit another big garment chain, and I went for it. I put on a suit, amazing. I went down feeling very important, and met their person there, and I tried to flannel them using lots of corporate language. So I talked about staff retention, reputational risk, institutional investors demanding all this stuff, and he was looking at me like this, and he said, "I just want to make the world a better place for my grandchildren." And I felt really stupid because I'd seen the guy in the suit, and I was talking to the suit, not the person. And I think that's something that activists do a lot of. And so I think we've got to get past that and build those relationships, and then see what can be done. It doesn't mean I'm not some sort of just understand the people and everything will be fine. But if you can do that, then you can get shifts. And a lot of the people we talk to in the UN program I run come up with the most amazing stories of what differences that can make. You get away from hierarchies, you talk to your driver and find your driver in Eritrea is actually massively well connected with government and can get you a meeting with anyone. So if you just forget the hierarchy for a minute and start talking to people, you find out really useful stuff. Just simple things like that.
Fabulous. Thanks so much. I'd like to give another warm round of applause.